Okay, so welcome to this first video in the playlist on learning and memory. In this video, what we're going to talk about is procedural learning. Okay, so procedural learning basically means more primitive forms of learning than declarative learning. Okay, so I'll come to this in a moment. So basically, procedural learning means changing your response to a stimulus. Okay, so basically, the basic setup is that you get a stimulus coming in. Okay, so you get sensory input coming in, and this will be detected by sensory receptors, and you're going to produce some response to this. Okay, now procedural learning is about changing the response to the stimulus based on past experience, basically. And I know that you could argue that all of learning surely is about changing your response to stimuli, but this is very much so a motor response, basically. Okay, so for instance, we're not interested in declarative memory. We're not interested in being able to recall things like, the definition of an isosceles triangle would be an example, or who the monarch of England was in 1916 or whatever. We're not interested in that sort of memory. We're interested in being able to remember how to perform a motor task. Okay, so it's a more primitive form of memory than declarative memory. Okay, right. So, procedural learning is often grouped into two types, okay? So we split procedural learning into two types. We have non-associative learning, okay, of which there are going to be two types within non-associative learning, which we'll come to in a moment. And then there's also associative learning, of which there are also two types within associative learning. Okay, so we're going to use these distinctions. So we're going to begin with non-associative learning, and I think the way to go in is just to go straight in for it. Okay, so we'll start with non-associative learning. Non-associative learning is very much so about changing the response to a stimulus, changing your motor response to a stimulus. So there are two types, okay? So the first is called habituation. Okay, and this is basically where you stop reacting, you stop having a motor response to stimuli which are unimportant, basically. So to stimuli which lack importance. Okay, so habituation is all about stopping reacting to stimuli of no importance. We have some stimulus with no importance, of no importance. And basically the idea is now that you're going to not produce a motor response to it anymore. You're not going to produce a response to it. So you're going to reduce your response to it. Okay, and I'm going to give you the common sense example of this. So for instance, if you have a clock within your bedroom, okay, then you might have, if you put that clock in for the first time, okay, so let's say you were used to sleeping in a bedroom where there was no clock, and you brought the clock in for the first time, then you would probably hear the tick-tock, tick-tock of the clock for the first night when you were actually sleeping, okay? But then, after weeks and weeks of sleeping with the clock, you will just forget that it was there. You wouldn't notice the tick-tock anymore. You don't process that. Well, you do. The information is still coming in through the auditory system, okay, and it's still reaching the brain, but you don't attach any importance to it, and you don't have any response to it. You certainly don't pay attention to it. Okay, now that's quite a high-level example of habituation. More low-level examples are just basically that you have some stimulus that isn't important, and initially you have some sort of reaction to it, but then after time of realizing that the stimulus means nothing, basically, you stop having that reaction to it. Okay, so that's habituation, where you stop having a response to a certain stimulus when you realize that that stimulus means nothing. And as I say, the common sense example is just, for instance, if you've got a bedroom with a clock in, or for instance, if you have a bedroom, if you're in a house that's next to a road, for instance, and there's constant traffic going past, when you first buy that house and go and live there, the road noise might really bother you because you'll hear it continuously. But then after weeks of living in that house, you just won't even notice the road noise anymore. It's still there. Your auditory system is still processing it and sending the information to the brain, but the brain doesn't do anything with that. It's learned not to bother, basically. Okay, so that's what habituation is all about. It's about stopping a response to stimuli that are unimportant, basically. Okay, so there is then the other example of non-associative learning, okay, which is the exact opposite, which is sensitization, which is basically increasing your response to a certain stimulus. Okay, so this time we've got some stimulus of importance this time, so this is a stimulus of importance, and basically you start off maybe with a low response to this stimulus, and then as it's repeatedly delivered, your response will get bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is about turning the response up. Okay, so I have got an example of this, but the example is kind of horrible, okay? But compared to some of the other examples that I've read, this is the most common sense one that I can see, basically. Some of the other ones, when you think about them, you'll sit there if you sit and think for long enough, you'll think, there's something wrong here. This isn't really illustrating what sensitization is about. And other ones, it goes too sort of like in detail. For instance, some of the other examples of sensitization you can explain by looking at the level of a neuron, and I don't really want it to be like that at the moment. Okay, so for instance, sensitization of pain neurons is often the example people give here. But my sort of common sense example for sensitization is if you have a dog, and we're going to come back to dogs when we come on to Pavlovian conditioning in a moment. Okay, so let's say this is our dog here. Right. And let's say you hit the dog, okay? So you're in a bad mood with the dog, but let's say the dog's done something bad and deserves to be hit. Well, maybe you'd argue that the dog never deserves to be hit, and there's always alternatives to violence. But just for the sake of the thought experiment, let's say, let's think about this scenario. Okay, so here's your dog. I'll just give it some little ears there. Okay, and you're going to hit the dog. And of course, what's the dog's response going to be? It's going to be sort of to cower back away from you, okay, when you hit it. Okay, now let's say it moves back. So the first time you hit it, what happens? It will move back a little bit from you, maybe. Okay, so it'll cower back a little bit. So it might go over here. Okay, like so. So it's moved back a little bit. Right. Now, let's say you walk up to the dog again, and let's say it's not scared enough of you to run away yet, and then you hit it again. This time, when you deliver the stimulus which is being hit again, it might run further away from you this time. Okay, let's say you pursue the dog again and hit it again, then it might run even further after that, okay, and then it might not come back, basically. If you might have to chase it to try and find it again, okay, so basically that is my example of sensitization, that as you hit the dog repeatedly, the amount of distance that it will want to put between you and itself will get greater, basically. Okay, so that's my common sense sort of sensitization example, that the response, which is running away from you, is going to get bigger, basically. It will want to put more distance between you and it as you repeatedly deliver the stimulus. Even if the intensity with which you hit the dog, i.e. how hard you hit the dog, isn't changing, then as you re-deliver the stimulus, it will increase its response. That is the concept of sensitization. And that's the second form of non-associative learning. So both of these non-associative learnings, they're just about changing your response to a stimulus. If the stimulus is unimportant, then you reduce your response. If the stimulus is important, for instance, because you're getting tissue damage, the dog's getting a bruise, then you increase the response to that. Okay, right. So now what we're going to go on to is associative learning. Now the difference between non-associative and associative learning is that non-associative learning only contains one stimulus. It's a response, it's learning about one stimulus, changing your response to one stimulus, whereas associative learning involves two stimuli which are going to be associated, okay? So, whoops, I've missed the two. So how am I going to rectify that? I'll have to put in like this, two stimuli. Okay, right. So, we're going to start off with the most famous form of associative learning, which is classical conditioning. And I think classical conditioning is more classically called Pavlovian conditioning. So, either classical conditioning or, whoops, what am I doing? Oh no, that is how you spell it. Pavlovian conditioning. Okay, and what I'm going to recite to you, firstly, is the famous experiment done by the physiologist Ivan Pavlov, which demonstrates Pavlovian conditioning. And then what we'll do is we'll back off and then put in some of the fancy nomenclature, because I want to get the concept across first before we actually go in for the fancy nomenclature, because I'm not sure the fancy nomenclature actually helps, okay? I want the common sense example first, and then we'll go in for the fancy nomenclature. Okay, right, and you've probably seen this before, but let's do it. Right, so basically Ivan Pavlov did these experiments with dogs, and they're very common sense experiments. You can predict the outcome easily. Okay, so Ivan Pavlov, and that should be an N, not an H, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so Ivan Pavlov did this experiment where basically what he did is he got a dog, okay, so I'll draw my little dog here, and basically he got some meat, okay, so we got a piece of meat, so in red here, this is a piece of meat, and he showed the meat to the dog, okay, so here is the meat, okay, and he showed the meat to the dog, so the dog can see and smell the meat, and what it starts to do is it starts to salivate, okay, so it starts to drool, and if you've got a dog, you'll know that dogs really do drool, if you've got a big dog anyway, okay, so you get huge lumps of saliva sort of drooling out of the sides of their mouth, okay, so the nice word for drooling is salivation. Okay, so the dog starts to salivate. Right, now, basically what he did is every time he was going to show the meat to the dog, basically before showing the dog the meat, what he did is he rang a bell, okay? So this is the training protocol now. So this is just, this is something that will happen, basically. If you show a dog some meat, it will salivate. Okay, we're now going to begin the Pavlovian conditioning, or the training. Okay, so basically this is what the training consists of. Okay, every time you want to show the dog the meat, before the dog gets to see the meat, what you will do is you'll ring a bell. Okay, so here is some bell, and you'll ring that bell, and then after you've rung the bell, you'll show the dog the meat. Okay, right, and then obviously once the dog sees the meat, what will happen is the dog will salivate. So here comes the saliva. Okay, right, so you repeat this several times basically, okay, and then what you do is you now take the dog, okay, and basically you ring the bell, and then you don't show it the meat. So we just ring the bell now, okay, and the dog will salivate. Okay, just to the sound of the bell. Whereas if you take a dog which you hadn't done this training exercise with, just a normal dog off the streets, and rung a bell, the dog would not salivate, basically. So you can get a dog to salivate to the sound of the bell just by putting it through this training protocol. That is the concept of Pavlovian conditioning, that the dog will learn that the bell means that it's about to be shown a piece of meat, and therefore that it should salivate, okay? So it learns to associate the sound of the bell with the meat, basically, and that's why it's called associative, that's why it's a form of associative learning, because it involves the two stimuli, the presentation of the meat and also the sound of the bell, and you're transferring the response that you get from the meat onto the response you get when you ring a bell at the dog. Okay, right. So now let's put in some fancy nomenclature to help or whatever. Okay, so basically the A normal dog will salivate in response to the meat, okay? So the meat, the stimulus of presenting the dog with the meat, is known as the unconditioned stimulus, okay? So meat, in this case, is the unconditioned stimulus, okay? And this is obviously so that we can, the reason for this fancy terminology is so that we can extend the principle beyond this specific example, okay, so we can have some general terminology to use for any example of this, because this obviously doesn't just work for dogs salivating in response to meat and getting them to associate being presented meat with a bell. Okay, right, so the meat is what's known as the unconditioned stimulus, okay? So this is often abbreviated to as the the US, so the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, now the dog initiates a response when presented with the unconditioned stimulus, which is the meat. That response, okay, so the salivation in response to meat, okay, so salivation in response to unconditioned stimulus, that's called the unconditioned response, okay? So conditioning refers to the training. Another word for training is conditioning, okay? So at the moment, we are just talking about things that you don't need to train a dog to do, and that's why it's unconditioned. So this is an unconditioned response. You didn't have to train the dog to salivate in response to the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, and the unconditioned response is often abbreviated to the UR. So basically, any old dog that you get off the streets will initiate the UR, the unconditioned response, to the unconditioned stimulus. Now what you do is you go through the protocol of conditioning or training, and what you do is you pair the unconditioned stimulus of being presented with meat with a new stimulus, which is the bell. Okay, so the second stimulus, which would not usually produce the unconditioned response, it wouldn't usually produce salivation, okay, this is known as the conditional stimulus. Okay, so this is only going to produce a response when you have undertaken the conditioning, okay? So this is the conditional stimulus. And for short, the conditional stimulus is often abbreviated to the CS. Okay, so if you just take a dog that hasn't been through training there and present it with the conditional stimulus, it will not initiate a response, or it won't initiate the response you want anyway. Okay, so now what you're going to do is you're going to take your dog, you're going to go through the process of training it, you will pair the conditional stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, and then the phenomenon of classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning is that then the dog will salivate when just presented with the conditional stimulus. So finally, the response of salivation in response to the conditional stimulus, so to the CS, this is called the conditioned response, okay, so the trained response. So the response that the dog will only initiate to the conditional stimulus if it has undergone conditioning, and the conditional response is often abbreviated to the CR for short. Okay, so let's just run through the entire thing then. So basically, if you present the unconditioned stimulus, you will get the unconditioned response. If you then go through the process of conditioning and you pair the unconditioned stimulus with the conditional stimulus, then in the training process, of course, when you present both the unconditional stimulus and the conditional stimulus, you will get the unconditioned response because you presented the unconditioned stimulus, okay? But then when you only give the conditional stimulus on its own, providing you've done enough training, then you should get the same response, which is now called the conditioned response, just in response to the conditional stimulus, basically. Okay, so that's Pavlovian or classical conditioning, basically. And what I just need to add is that if you want this to work, you need to have the pairing of the unconditioned stimulus, the meat, and the conditional stimulus, the bell, you need to have them paired nearby. So either you need to ring the bell at the same time as you present the meat, or you need to ring the bell just before you present the meat, basically. You can't do it half an hour before. The dog will not learn classical/Pavlovian conditioning if the conditional stimulus is presented too far in advance of the unconditioned stimulus. So they need to be paired reasonably close together. Okay, to actually get classical/Pavlovian conditioning. The other thing to say is that if you keep delivering the conditional stimulus after the training is complete, so we've got our trained dog here, if you keep delivering the conditional stimulus, which is the bell ringing, for long enough, you do it many, many times without giving the dog the meat as well, then the conditioning will undo itself, basically. So eventually, when the dog has salivated enough times in response to the bell without being presented meat, it will learn that the bell actually doesn't warrant salivation anymore, okay, that it doesn't show that the meat is coming, and therefore it will stop performing the conditioned response, which is the salivation in response to the conditional stimulus, okay. And the phenomenon that basically Pavlovian conditioning can be undone if you abuse it too much, basically. If you try delivering the conditional stimulus too much without the unconditional stimulus. That's known as extinguishment, okay? So the response will be extinguished. Okay, so extinguished. Right, okay, so that then now is classical/Pavlovian conditioning. In the next video, what we'll move on to is instrumental conditioning.